All right, so just repeating that one more time, we are recording tonight's session. If you do not wish to appear on the recording, either on audio or video, please just make sure that your audio and video are disabled. Interactions that go in the chat will not appear on the recording. So with that, I believe, yes, all right. So that is all I have to share. So at this point, I am going to turn it over to Norm. Norm, take it away.
Thank you very much. It's very nice being with you in San Antonio. I would have preferred that this were in person since it's below freezing here in Boston. But anyway, we'll manage this way. And I look forward to your questions and comments afterwards. So pretty much everyone has some knowledge of the Holocaust, but very few people have knowledge of the event we're going to be talking about today. It's an event that involves the United States. It's an event that lingers over time, and with the question of how do we deal with newcomers coming to America. So what I'd like to do is I will give you a little summary of what the book is about, what the event was about. At 7:30 a.m. on August 5th, 1944, the first of two special trains arrived at Fort Ontario in Oswego, New York. On board were 982 men, women, and children, refugees from Nazi terror in Europe, where World War II was still raging. This was the only group of Holocaust survivors to reach the United States during World War II. Other European Jews were not so fortunate. By 1942, a good chunk of Europe was in Nazi hands. By the time World War II ended, 6 million would be dead. They were killed in concentration camps and by gunfire executions. Their deaths and the destruction of ancient Jewish communities throughout Europe were a result of Hitler's final solution to erase an entire people. So, as I was saying, a person's ability to escape depended on not being at the wrong place at the wrong time. In many cases, it was simply a matter of luck if an individual lived or died. Although Italy was aligned with Germany at the beginning of the war, it was still a safer place for Jews to be trying to escape from other parts of Europe. The thousands of Jewish refugees seeking safety in Italy faced many problems. An immediate problem was geography. The closest route to Italy from other parts of Europe went over the Alps. With little choice, groups of Jews of all ages made the difficult climb over towering icy mountains. Ruth Gruber was a journalist who served as an assistant to Secretary of the Interior, Harold Ickes. He sent her to accompany the refugees from Europe. She said, quote, "These 1,000 people came from 19 countries. Some have been refugees since 1939, some since 1933 when Hitler took power. The path of their immigration and escape was the path of Hitler's march across Europe. He came to Germany, they fled to Austria. He came to Austria, the Germans and Austrians fled to Czechoslovakia. He came to Czechoslovakia, they fled to Poland. He came to Poland, they fled through the Balkans to Yugoslavia, and from there, they fled to Italy. While some Jews hid and changed their names to appear Italian, others lived as Catholics. Jewish children were sometimes enrolled in Catholic schools or entrusted to nuns. There were many instances of people being saved in churches and convents. The Italian government set up a number of camps to house these homeless refugees. Unlike in German concentration camps, residents were not tortured or killed, but as the war progressed, conditions in those camps worsened. A question often asked is why European Jews could not find refuge in the United States. Two answers, not mutually exclusive: strict immigration laws and latent anti-Semitism. American Jews did what they could to save the European brethren, but the mainstream Jewish leadership treaded lightly. Led by Rabbi Stephen Wise, a friend of President Roosevelt, They believed in quiet backroom diplomacy. Another group of more activist Jews, led by Peter Bergson, pushed public relations to the limit to embarrass the government into action. Anti-Jewish feelings in America were at a fever pitch just prior to the outbreak of World War II. Prejudice against Jews in the United States in the 1930s took many forms. Dozens of anti-Jewish organizations were founded then. Father Charles Coughlin attracted millions of listeners to his very popular radio program, which continually broadcast anti-Jewish opinions, accusing all Jews of being communists, for example. The German-American Bund, founded in 1936 by people of German ancestry, publicly supported the Nazi agenda. They operated youth and training camps and had a membership across the country in tens of thousands. There were America's first isolationist groups fighting to keep America out of any European war. One of its leaders was the hero aviator Charles Lindbergh, who accused American Jews of leading the country into war. As war progressed, public opinion in the United States regarding Jews underwent a dramatic reversal. News of the atrocities committed by the Nazis was now common knowledge. In a Gallup poll taken in April 1944, 70% of American Jews now favored giving, quote, temporary protection and refuge to those people in Europe persecuted by the Nazis. This gave President Roosevelt a political excuse for moving forward on aiding European refugees. The pressure on him by the lobbying of Bergson and his followers began having an impact on public opinion. Early in January 1944, a sharply worded report landed on the desk of Robert Morgenthau, Secretary of the Treasury, and a personal friend of President Roosevelt. Treasury Department staff were upset that the State Department had erected barriers to save refugees. Their report, titled, quote, Report to the Secretary on the Acquiescence of this Government in the Murder of the Jews, directly accused the United States government of purposely blocking the rescue of European Jews. Morgenthau, himself Jewish, was shocked by what he read. Toning down the sharp language, he reshaped the document and handed it directly to President Roosevelt under a less accusatory title, quote, Report to the President. The result was the creation of the War Refugee Board. The board's directors included Cordell Hull, the Secretary of State, Henry Morgenthau, Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Stimson, the Secretary of War, and John Pele as its executive director. To set an example to other countries to set up emergency refugee shelters, Roosevelt decided to admit 1,000 refugees to the United States at an emergency shelter at Fort Ontario, New York. Italy was chosen as the selection site since the number of refugees there began to overtax American Army facilities. The 982 ultimately selected to come to Oswego were hastily collected and placed on a Navy troop ship, the Henry Gibbons. The voyage was fraught with danger. German airplanes and submarines threatened, and crowded conditions aboard made life uncomfortable. But the travelers were overwhelmed by the amount and variety of food available. Before boarding, each refugee signed a document which stated that at the end of the war, they would be returned to their homelands. Soldiers and Red Cross volunteers who helped the refugees off the ship in New York were appalled by what they saw. The arrivals were in their rags, some of them still in the pajamas of prison camps and concentration camps. Many were without shoes, and others had their feet wrapped in newspapers. Most were thin and frail. All were near exhaustion after their long ordeal. The next morning, they were placed on trains for the 5-hour trip to Oswego. Their arrival in Fort Ontario resulted in a moment of panic. Although the morning was bright and sunny, and the view of a shimmering Lake Ontario comforting, the sight of a barbed wire topped fence encircling the camp, guard watchtowers, and armed soldiers reminded them of the life they left behind. The fear quickly disappeared as the refugees were welcomed with cookies and ice cream. One woman recalled, quote, "We had all this food, so we knew it wasn't a concentration camp." In the haste to get the ship moving back to Italy, refugees were identified by numbered tags, which were marked U.S. Army casual baggage. While the adult refugees were being interviewed and fingerprinted on their arrival at Fort Ontario, the children felt free to explore the fort and approach the fence, where local Oswego residents gathered to watch the arrival. Local children and refugee children who couldn't speak each other's languages soon found a way to communicate. This was the beginning of a largely friendly and supportive welcome by Oswegonians of their newest neighbors. The day after their arrival, an official ceremony welcomed the newcomers. Shelter Director Joseph Smart put the newcomers at ease by telling them, "Whenever there is a knock on the door, it will be a friendly one." A synagogue was opened on the site, since 874 of the 982 arrivals were Jewish. Shelter organizers soon realized that one Jewish house of worship was not enough. Around 200 of the Jews were Orthodox, for whom the egalitarian original setup was not acceptable. Soon, there were 2 synagogues and a separate kosher dining hall at the fort. The most famous visitor to the shelter was Eleanor Roosevelt. She was greeted warmly and took time to speak with refugees for whom the visit was a boost in morale. In her national newspaper column a few days later, Mrs. Roosevelt wrote, quote, "Restrictions are plentiful and there is much work to be done around the place, but at least the menace of death is not ever present." The refugees settled in. There were jobs to be done. They were not allowed to work outside the shelter, but they were paid to work inside. A job rotation system was set up as refugees made repairs, collected garbage, and helped with the kitchen work. They were allowed 6-hour passes every day to go into the city of Oswego. There, they enjoyed patronizing shops, libraries, restaurants, and movie theaters, but they could not travel beyond Oswego to visit relatives elsewhere in the country. Life became normalized for them. There were social and educational activities, medical and dental care. They had arrived in rags, and within a short time, they now dressed like everyone else and learned all they could about American culture. As the war winded down, they now became extremely concerned. The words of the form they signed in Europe hung over their heads. At the end of the war, they were to be returned to their homelands. An unusual opportunity for boys was the establishment of a Boy Scout troop right within the fort. The boys proudly wore their Scout uniforms and enjoyed typical Scout activities, especially hiking. Cub Scout and Girl Scout troops soon followed. There were 232 children in the shelter of school age, and they were incorporated into Oswego schools. Language difficulties at first separated them from the native kids, but within a short period, the sheltered children adjusted quickly. After not being in school for years, or sometimes never, the sheltered children took education seriously. Because of their commitment to learning, they were a positive influence on their American classmates. Older sheltered teens and young adults were accepted into the Oswego State Teachers College. At the end of the school year, 6 of the shelter students at Oswego High School took and passed the required New York State exams, allowing them to graduate. For the parents, the successful school experiences of their children were highlights of their stay in Oswego. When World War II ended in Europe on May 8, 1945, the concern of shelter residents about their futures became even more urgent. Outwardly, they appeared happy and engaged in their usual pursuits, but underneath simmered the question, what will happen now? Despite the agreement signed in Naples, they had no homes or families to return to in Europe. They wanted to remain in the United States. After much lobbying on their behalf and some creative interpretations of immigration requirements, President Harry Truman issued an executive order allowing the shelter residents to use quota numbers from their respective countries that were unclaimed during the war. By mid-February 1946, the Fort Ontario shelter was closed and the former residents resettled in 68 communities in 20 states. They went on to productive lives in this country as United States citizens. So that's the formal presentation. I'm just sorry you could not see the photos that went along, with this. But I need to amplify a couple of things. So first of all, how do they end up, getting admitted into the United States as legal, immigrant candidates? The immigration laws in the United States were extremely strict. And President Truman, hit on the fact that, well, we had all these quota numbers that went unused during the war. But in order to get a visa into the United States, you had to be outside of the United States. And so the question then, wait a minute, do we take these 982 people and ship them back to Europe so they can apply for visas to come back to the United States? No. And then someone realized, wait a minute, there's a foreign country 2 hours away. It's called Canada. And they set up a system of buses where they took refugees for the 2-hour ride into Canada. The American consul there at Niagara Falls had visas waiting for them. They went back on the bus, and now they became legal residents of the United States with the visas. That was just one very interesting thing that came out of and there are so many other details that I cannot go into now, but I hope that you have questions that you may want to ask that may fill in some of the unanswered, questions that the book has brought about. So I'm going to leave turn things back over to Morgan.
Sounds great. Thanks so much, Norm. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. So for folks that are interested, we do own Norm's book, Shelter in the Fence. I put the link in the chat. So if you'd like to put a hold on that and have it delivered to your local library branch, please do that. I think we have at least 4 or 5 copies, and we can get more if we need to. So yes, that's the one. I've read it. It's so interesting. And so yes, please put that on hold so you can really get the full knowledge. Norm's given a great overview. We are having some questions coming in chat, but while I let those trickle in, Norm, I know you shared with me a little bit, but how did you initially learn about the refugee camp at Fort Oswego, and what was it about it that interested you to research it more and to write a book about it?
Thank you. So I had known about it, but just cursorily. I have taught courses on the Holocaust. I write books about American Jewish history. So I kind of knew it was there, but it was in the back of my mind, and I never knew about the details. I just knew that, during the war, there was a place in upstate New York and so forth. And so a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, I got an email from my former boss. I was a public school librarian for many years, and she was the director of school libraries. And she was a native Oswegonian. I love saying that, by the way. She was a native Oswegonian. And she said, they're going to be doing the 75th anniversary of the shelter. And you might want to come. And, it didn't take me but 2 seconds to say, I'm coming. And I spent 2 days, it was a 2-day event of 75th anniversary, Of the 30 odd refugees still known alive, 17 were there in Oswego. And the city, just turned everything open. It was an amazing event. And I got to hear the stories of many of these refugees, in person, and visit, Oswego, and visit, the fort. I just happened to cursorily notice that in the chat, someone had asked the question about if anything remains, of that. Actually, no. All the buildings, those are all gone. But what does remain is a museum, which is a wonderful museum, the Safe Haven Museum in Oswego, New York, which is right there on the grounds. It was one of the buildings that was used, by the refugees. So there are a couple of those buildings left, but I would strongly recommend, if you're coming north, go to Oswego, New York, and visit this museum. So while I'm there listening to all of the speeches and the presentations and so forth, my wife was with me, and I kind of nudged her and I said, "This is the next book." And this is literally what happened. And my brilliant publisher, Chicago Review Press, agreed, and that was that. Because I found that even when I teach Holocaust classes, no one knows about this. No one knows about this.
Yeah.
So I happen to notice cursorily too that another question came into place. Did people know about this at the time? And yeah, it was. I don't think it was that widely known, but within the Jewish community, it certainly was, and it did get press at the time. Most papers throughout the country, ran stories about the refugee shelter. But again, over the decades, the story has largely been forgotten.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for that, Norm. And I know I personally, as we chose the theme this year of immigration and refugees, and, was starting to do some research of, what are some potential speakers and topics, and I came across your book and I said, well, we have to invite him. So thankfully you were gracious to join us. Yeah, some more questions that have come in through chat. You've grabbed a couple of them. Do you know what the general opinion of either folks, like Americans that were living in New York at the time, or just in general in the US, like what was their opinion, or even of those that lived in Oswego, like what was their opinion towards this camp and those that were living there?
That's a great question. It's very interesting. Why does Roosevelt choose this particular site? First of all, as a former governor of New York, he was familiar with Fort Ontario. He had visited there, on many occasions, and it was a perfect spot. First of all, it was vacant, but the city of Oswego itself had been very welcoming. Just before the war, Fort Ontario was a training ground for African-American soldiers. This would not have been a welcome, group in places in other parts of the country, but the city of Oswego welcomed, those soldiers. And the city of Oswego also held a United Nations parade, honoring all of the Allied fighting troops. And so the city had opened itself up to soldiers and sailors from other countries as well, who were fighting on our side for a special program. So the city itself was welcoming. There were really no major negative reactions. The part of the story that I love the most as a former public school teacher is the way the school system welcomed these refugee kids. Really, they went out of their way So within a few days of their arriving at the shelter, public school officials went to the shelter to talk with the kids and their parents, to interview them, to see how they would fit in, in terms of what their previous knowledge was, and so forth. The interaction of the kids in the schools is quite amazing. There's a story in the book that one of the refugees tells that that at first the American students said, look, these guys, all they want to do is study, they're not like us. But over time, the public librarian, in the city remarked that there was a growing number of local kids going to libraries to take books out to learn about the countries that their new friends came from, and so forth and so on. They were a positive influence on education.
Yeah.
And the thing is, as I mentioned, the refugees, had freedom of the city. Actually, they were living in this camp. But the moment they arrived, within the day after they arrived, the armed guards were gone, and basically, and they, there were civilian guards, just to keep order and so forth. But they frequented the libraries. They frequented local restaurants. It was a very welcoming kind of thing. And this was really, when I went to the anniversary, to the 75th anniversary, this was really clear to me that the people in Oswego still today have great pride in how all of this was handled.
Gotcha. Wonderful. Another question, Norm, do you have any information, or did you find any information in your research as far as how were those 982 people selected? Was there criteria? Was there what was that process?
Another good question. So first of all, remember, Roosevelt says we're going to let 1,000 in. Okay. And we end up with 982 because the ship had to leave. It was part of a convoy. And so they asked people to apply. And there was a selection committee. And the major criteria there were several criteria. One, that families were to be kept together. That was one. And the other thing is that, again, because of this latent anti-Semitism, this wasn't all going to be Jewish. And so there were, Catholic, Greek Orthodox, Protestant, there. Of course, the Jews were the bulk, whatever. And the other thing was they were looking for a broad population, so they wanted people from a variety of backgrounds. So it just so happens, the way it turns out, there were a lot of people in the group who were artistically inclined. There were some actors, there were some writers, there were artists and whatever, but there were business people, there were professionals, just a wide range of people. There, interestingly enough, the residents, because of the talent that people had, created their own newspaper. They had a weekly newspaper that was done on, well, some of you may not be as old as me, but there were mimeograph machines, and they had a weekly newspaper that was mimeographed that gave everybody the news of what was happening.
Gotcha. Thank you. And another question, Norm, is so someone, they did specifically ask, do you know if there are any, or did you find in your research, or have you written about it at all, about basically these folks' lives after they were fully American citizens? What was their life, or do you have any stories that you could share that you're aware of about their lives after they were released from the refugee camp?
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's a mixed bag. You have to remember that a lot of these people were damaged. The hell that they had gone through in Europe. I did not go into the details of the journey over, but that was hell-filled as well. On an army transport, crowded with until they hit American waters. There were submarines lurking. I mean, this was just terrible. And many of them, as I mentioned, came with the shirt on their back. That was it. There were people who were barefoot. The idea was to get out. And many of them were professionals, back in Europe. When the war was over and they actually were dispersed to, I don't know, throughout the country, literally, after the war, many of them did not, take the resume the kind of professions that they had, back in Europe, again, because of educational things. I'll tell you one really nice story. So there were two brothers, the Margolis brothers, who were older. They were probably at that point 19, 20, who before leaving Yugoslavia had begun attending medical school. And when they came here, they finished they graduated, received their diplomas from Oswego, high school, and they had applied to Harvard Medical School. And they were accepted to Harvard Medical School while they were in the shelter.
Wow.
But there was a problem. Remember, I said the refugees could not go more than a few miles beyond the city of Oswego.
Okay.
And there's a distance between Oswego and Cambridge, Massachusetts. They ultimately, there was a small group, probably about 60, nearly all of them Yugoslavian, who returned home right after the war, rather than staying here in the United States. The brothers, however, went back to Yugoslavia and then came back here and attended Harvard Medical School. And both became, very renowned physicians. And there are other stories like that too. There was one man who was an artist who used to draw pictures for the camp shelter newspaper. And after the war, he ultimately became the chief director for a magazine that some of you may be familiar with, called Mad Magazine.
Really? Wow.
And there are other stories like that, like that as well. And then there's also the story of a man, I think he was a furniture dealer, in Europe, but after the war, just, there was nothing much that he could do at that point. And so he became the sexton of a synagogue. But they all ended up doing something. The key thing, of course, one of the things that came out during the 75th anniversary thing is not necessarily how they survived, but the fact that they had families afterwards and how successful their own children became. In America, there are really amazing stories of survival.
Wow, wonderful. Yeah. Just, having that opportunity, right, to be able to have a family and to start a new life. That's an incredible opportunity for sure.
It was very difficult. So, so after the war, aid agencies, many Catholic Relief, there were Jewish organizations as well, worked to welcome, these families to, different cities throughout the United States. And the stories are quite lovely, and how they were welcomed. It's interesting because the residents were given choices of where they might want to go. Not so oddly enough, many of them chose New York, which so a number of them did end up in the New York City area. But there were a few who actually remained around the Oswego area as well because of the way they had been treated.
Yeah, wonderful. Yeah, they had obviously, fond memories of, I mean, if it's a good area for them to be in, why go somewhere else, for sure. Still questions coming in. Do you know if this, so the establishment of this refugee camp and the way that it was received, do you know that if it affected the treatment of subsequent refugee groups, whether, related to the Holocaust or just any future, that were shortly after that? Do you know if it had any impact?
I don't know if it had a direct impact. Again, indirectly, it was an example of what could be done. But I fear that, other people who could have, used the benefit of coming to the United States to be rescued. I mean, I don't think there was much, that followed. I noticed that also appearing in the chat, because I'm looking briefly as there was a question about, whether at the time there was objection to the refugees coming to the United States. Not really. I mean, there were some, politicians in Washington who, basically saying, well, wait a minute, how can we let these people in because they don't have visas and they have, and the thing is that many of these people had applied for visas to the United States beforehand. But you remember the whole business of the Treasury Department kind of doing battle with the State Department, because the State Department at that time, I won't mince words, was anti-Semitic. And the Breckinridge Long, who was I forget his exact title in the State Department, he was in charge of visas, and he basically sent a memo out to all of the American embassies and consulates in Europe. He says, you gotta, I'll paraphrase, do stumbling blocks, delay getting these people visas. I mean, this was, a known fact. This was a terrible, terrible thing. But Roosevelt, again, because of the refugees now taxing American military in 1944, during the war, he says, well, we got to do something, and we got to create, places where we can send these refugees. And he's talking about places in North Africa. He's talking about places that have already been, been freed by the Americans and so forth. He says, but you know what? We got to do something here, just to set an example. And that's how the Fort Ontario thing came about, but limited to 1,000 people.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I know that in the description of your book, you call it a token save, which I think is very much the case of,
I mean, it's a token save, but for that token group of 982, it,
had a significant impact. Yeah, definitely, for sure. Yeah. Another great question that just came in, which, I mean, that's part of why, I mean, this question is part of why we're doing this theme this year. So, Norm, in your opinion, what is an important takeaway from the U.S.'s impact on the lives of these 982 people that came to Fort Oswego, and thinking about our present approach to immigration, refugees, asylum seekers? What lessons are there to be learned, do you think?
Well, that's a difficult one. I know. I'm not a politician.
Right.
But, there are people, who are in pain. And there are people who, are really, suffering and needing asylum. And this country has always offered, people, in such straits, the way to come to America, and so forth. So I don't know. I don't have an answer to this, because I know that particularly where you are in the South, that you have this, this real problem. And I have no answer to that at all.
Yeah.
The only thing I can say is that my own family came to this country, and they came to this country legally, going through all of the steps, all of the paperwork, all of the whatever that was necessary to bring them, here.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's all I can say.
Yeah, no, I get it. Immigration is a tricky topic. I get that. Yeah, for sure. So thanks for being open to that question. But yeah, I mean, and I think that's part of why we're doing this theme this year too. Is immigration is not a new thing. We're a country of immigrants. So for sure, I mean, I think it's helpful sometimes to reflect on the history of immigration and realize that this is not a new thing. So yeah, definitely. Yeah, for sure. I'm curious if folks, if you have questions, please continue to put them into the chat. We're getting close to that 7:30 mark, but certainly please continue to, if you have any questions, let us know. Norm, do you know why this particular location, camp, et cetera, was selected to house, like, why Oswego, New York?
Okay.
Do you have any information about that one?
Very simple reason. The President of the United States knew it. That was it. I mean,
Got it.
I don't know. I mean, literally, I mean, there could be thousands of places around the country that could have been selected.
Got it.
But this was a fort that at that very moment was not in use. And there were barracks already set up. Of course, what they did to prepare, because some of the barracks were in, they were regular army barracks, whatever. And so before the refugees actually arrived, here, they actually fixed the barracks up, making the rooms useful for families, building kitchens and having areas for privacy. I mean, the walls were very thin, but there were walls nonetheless.
Right.
There were old army barracks that were reconditioned, and so the fort was there, and it was
available. It was convenient. Yeah, that makes sense. And I guess I mean, clearly, I'm sure the president had folks doing research for him and selecting it. But yeah, it's interesting for sure. All right. I know you were telling me a little, so folks are asking about what projects you're currently working on. So I know you were sharing a little bit, but you tell me how much you want to share at this point.
Okay.
What you're working on now.
I'm just finishing up a book for general readers, adults and so forth. It's called Facing Anti-Semitism in America, which is basically a history, kind of timely in terms of what just took place in Texas a couple of days ago. But the book is really a historical look at anti-Semitism in America that begins in 1654 when the first Jews arrived, and it continues on. But the basic theme of the book is how the larger American community and how the Jewish community reacted to each of these historical events as they have taken place. So that will be out with the University of Nebraska Press, God willing, I think 2 years. They have to chop the trees down first.
Exactly. Yes. As we were talking, writing is a long process, but an exciting one. If you're interested in getting more information about Norm, about the other books that Norm has, I've just put his website in the chat. I believe we have a number of them available through the San Antonio Public Library. So if there's any of them that you're interested in, you can certainly check them out there. Another question, Norm, do you know, as far as like how many children were born while the shelter was operating?
I want to take a guess at this point. I did know that but I think maybe about 8 or 9 kids were actually born, in the shelter, which of course made them automatically American citizens. And that was another question, by the way. When
I'm sure.
When the first child was about to be born, Washington was thrown into a tizzy. In other words, these people are not, they don't have legal papers. They're not legal or whatever. What do we do with the kid born in this shelter? And, the powers that be in Washington had this big debate going on, until they finally said, well, if the kid's born here, the kid's American. And, it's as simple as all that.
It's a simple answer. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I'm sure. Definitely. Very cool. Very cool. All right. Well, thank you everyone so much for joining. Norm, before we wrap up, anything else any final thoughts you wanted to share with us before we wrap up for tonight?
No, I just think that this whole event of what happened to these 982 people is something that more people should be aware of. It's a very profound instance of what can happen if people put their minds to it, in terms of saving people and in terms of welcoming newcomers to a community. And then we see the positive result of what happened. In other words, because of the treatment, because of the fact that they were let into the country in the first place, that these refugees, their children, their grandchildren have all become, upstanding, contributing American citizens. And I think that's the message.
Absolutely. Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. Definitely. I mean, the more we can be compassionate and recognize the opportunity that we have to welcome people from other countries into this country so that they can have opportunities, I think we're a better country for it. So